I'm going to stop video.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Ari. Hi, Brendan. Hi, Lisa. Hi, Pamela. Hey, Jeff. Hey, Gail. We'll give it a couple minutes to let people hop on. Hey, Stanley. Hi, Christine. Hi, Diane. Thank you all for coming. We'll get started at 7:02. We'll give a couple people or a couple minutes to let people get on. Hey, Matthew. Hi, Sue. Hi, Jenny. Hi, Sergio. Good afternoon, Theodora. Thank you all for coming. Yay. Hi, Donna. Hey, Jim. Hey, Lee. I like your last name, Lee. Lee Berger. It's awesome. Hi, Heidi. We'll start in about 1 minute. Hey, Lisa. Hey, Brendan. Hi, Patricia. Hope you all are doing well tonight. Thank you all for being here. Hey, Mary. All right, everybody. Thank you all for coming and welcome. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Medicaid long-term planning from an elder law perspective, brought to you by NAMI Cook County North Suburban and Paige Fox, an elder law attorney, advocate, and activist for our community members and those in the Chicagoland area. I am Bree Hoekstra, the program director at NAMI Cook County North Suburban. NAMI, or the National Alliance on Mental Illness, is the nation's largest grassroots mental health organization, providing public awareness, no-cost support, and education programs online and in person so that people and families affected by mental health conditions can build better lives. We are a lifeline to individuals and families who do not know what to expect in their difficult life journey. We offer classes and support groups and do a lot of local advocacy for mental health. Our programs are free and open to those in our 17 community service areas, but we don't turn anyone away who is in need. Thank you for coming again, and our topic tonight deals with long-term care planning for seniors and individuals who have disabilities. According to the National Institute on Aging, long-term care involves a variety of services designed to meet a person's health or personal care needs during a short period of time. These services help people live as independently and safely as possible when they can no longer perform everyday activities on their own. We are living in a time where finances are becoming more and more stressful by the minute. The North American Mental Health Professional Advice Council lists 10 causes of financial stress. Those include rising debt, job-related, education-related, medical-related, marital or family issues, home expenses, lack of savings, no progress, unnecessary expenditures, and getting closer to retirement. Not to mention that inflation is at its highest level in the last 40 years. Having financial hardships can affect a person's mental health. Researchers at the Global Financial Literacy Excellence Center looked at a survey answers from more than 19,000 adults in the US and found that 60% of respondents indicated feeling anxious when thinking about their personal finances, when 50% of respondents indicated feeling stressed when discussing their finances. 65% of women and 54% of men indicated feeling anxious about their personal finances. It is apparent that long-term planning is essential for individuals, especially those with disabilities, many of whom require long-term care at some point in their lives. During tonight's webinar, Paige will highlight the importance of long-term planning and has stated that this type of care can be expensive. And without proper planning, it can quickly deplete an individual's savings and assets. Through her presentation, the hope is to lighten the feelings of stress and anxiety when thinking and planning for your financial future. We will leave plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. If you would like to type questions in the chat box during our conversation, please do. Tonight's guest speaker, Paige Fox, is an elder law attorney in the Chicagoland area and has been practicing since 2015, where she worked at both the Elder Law and Estate Planning Attorneys of Illinois, PC, as well as the Chuhawk and Peskin, PC. Paige has assisting clients of all ages with estate planning, special needs planning, asset preservation and Medicaid planning, trust administration, probate estates, guardianship, negotiations with long-term care facilities, contract review, and overall assistance with navigating the challenges seniors and individuals with disabilities must navigate on a daily basis. Paige is able to empathize with clients while also communicating complex issues in a thorough yet simplified manner, and considers herself an advocate for her clients throughout the entire long-term care process. Paige is also very active in the elder law and legal community, currently acting as president-elect for the Illinois chapter of NAELA, or the National Academy of Elder Law Attorney, co-chair for Illinois NAELA's Education Committee, co-chair for the Serving Our Seniors Committee of the CBA's Young Lawyer Section, member of the National NAELA's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, as well as the member of Illinois NAELA's Sponsorship, Membership, and Social Media Committees. Paige has created a presentation tonight that will provide our participants with a general outline of long-term care and other Medicaid planning strategies that can help individuals protect assets for themselves and their family, while still qualifying for public benefits and assistance paying for long-term. I am honored to welcome our guest speaker tonight, Paige Fox.
Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share the presentation. Like Brianna said, this is a presentation on Medicaid and overall long-term care planning. I'm going to kind of hit on the general topics in terms of costs of care, aging statistics, stuff like that, but the main bulk of the presentation will be about Medicaid and specific Medicaid planning techniques. Okay, so here's the agenda. Aging statistics, types of long-term care, costs of paying for long-term care, and Medicaid planning. And at the end, like she said, will be a question and answer session. So looking at statistics and just kind of wondering as to why it's why long-term care is so important and why planning is so important. It's looking at not only statistics, but also costs. So first is looking at the statistics. If you look here, it says that over 70% of adults aged 75 years and older will require long-term care at some point. That means either you're in a facility, a skilled care facility, which is a nursing home, or a supportive living facility, possibly a rehab center, but some sort of long-term care. And also life expectancy average life expectancy as of 2021 was 76.1 years of age versus the 68 years back in the 1950s. Another statistic to look at is that 26% of women ages 65 to 74 lived alone as of 2018, and 55% of women ages 85 and older live alone. This is related to the gender differences in terms of length of life, which has been getting closer, but there is still a gap in that. So that's reflective of that. Another statistic is, oh, sorry about that. I'm still trying to. And so it also says that Alzheimer's disease and dementia could double into more than 13.8 million people as of 2050. So again, these are all different reasons as to why long-term care planning and Medicaid planning are becoming more important, because the more that the baby boomer generation ages, the more and more elders that we will have in the population. In 2050, 80% of older people who will be living in low and middle income countries as well. Between 2015 and 2050, the proportion of the world's population over 60 years of age will nearly double from 12% to 22%. Types of long-term care. So just general, or just a little heads up that there are a lot of different topics within this specific topic that you could probably do, honestly, your own presentation on each specific thing. So this is really going to be a general overview of everything. And I will make sure to note types of things that there's definitely a lot more information out there. So for types of long-term care, we are looking at in-home caregivers. So this can be a service. Sometimes people hire individuals not through a service, but through pay with cash, which we can talk about later. There's the continuing care communities. There's places that you might be familiar with in the Chicagoland area would include like Sedgebrook or Friendship Village. Those are examples of continued care communities. Independent living facilities, assisted living facilities, supportive living facilities, skilled care facilities, which are also known as nursing homes, and then other types of facilities. With caregivers, this would be something that you're paying hourly. Oftentimes it's somebody that you bring into the home who cares for the individual who needs the caregiving. This is sometimes family members as well, which again, we will discuss later on a little bit more. In-home caregiving services. So caregiving services versus paying cash. There are quite a few services out there that are specifically geared toward in-home caregivers. But something that I've seen very often while dealing with particularly Medicaid planning is that a lot of times, because the cost of in-home caregiving is so expensive and it's not covered by something like Medicaid, families oftentimes will pay people under the table using cash or check to cash because it's just cheaper. That's something that it's not necessarily, the main issue that comes with that is when we are dealing with Medicaid in the future, trying to prove where those payments came from and why you made those payments. So we'll get to that later on, but that's something that I see often. Checks to family members. So again, it's not uncommon for family members to be caregivers. And then the expense, it's very expensive when it comes to in-home caregivers. I think the average is $27 an hour is the national average. So depending on how many hours a day somebody needs in-home caregiving, that can obviously get quite expensive. In terms of in-home caregiving services, like I said, family members also often do it. Two things that we will discuss later on in the presentation relates to caregiver agreements for family members providing care services, and also exempt transfers under Medicaid as related to caregivers. Facilities and dealing with facilities. So there are quite a few things that we deal with when it comes to facilities. I'm going to go back. Sorry, I'm so sorry. I'm trying to figure out the best way to, here it is. So types of long-term care. So the caregivers. So these continuing care retirement communities, like I said, these are places that, and oftentimes it's a continued care community. So you start in what it is like an independent living type situation, and then you move throughout their entire system. So for example, Friendship Village is a continued care community, and they start, they have an independent level, they have skilled care, they have assisted living, they have all the different levels. So you start and you kind of work your way up. In independent living facilities, those are ones where basically the individual, you can have your own apartment, oftentimes maybe even your own house, but it is connected to a facility or the overall facility. So you can get food and dining services and the like from there. Assisted living facilities, it's one level up in care in terms of oftentimes you do still have your own apartment, but will be within one building where there's like rooms, kind of like a, like a hotel type situation look with the individual apartments. Supportive living facilities is exactly like assisted living, except supportive living facilities accept Medicaid payments. Assisted living facilities do not. Supportive living facilities, because this is such a new thing, there are not many out there. They're popping up more and more, but the reason that they started popping up was because we were finding that there were individuals who were having to go into nursing homes or skilled care facilities, which is a much higher level of care than a supportive living facility or an assisted living facility, but they were only having to go into the nursing home because they didn't have the money to pay for a facility like such as an assisted living facility where they could have their own apartment, which is why supportive living facilities started popping up, so that, they didn't need to be in a full skilled care facility. They could still have their own apartment, but it was covered by Medicaid. The next level up would be skilled care facilities. Like I mentioned, those are your old school nursing homes. And then other types of facilities that you deal with would be hospitals, rehab places, hospice facilities, etc. So we had talked about that. And dealing with the facilities. So I had mentioned with the in-home caregivers, there are the issues there in terms of types of payments that you're making to the facility or to the caregivers, and the overall expense, because it can be very expensive. In terms of dealing with the facilities, there are also concerns there. And I will say that, at least from my perspective, in terms of elder law, I mostly, when I'm dealing with facilities, I would mostly deal with the administrators in the business office. And so those were the ones who are very much more focused on money and that side of things. I always say that, I never trust anybody in what somebody says at the administrative office of a facility, because they're more focused on money and you just need to be careful. Whereas the people on the floor, they're little angels in terms of taking care of people. But when you're dealing with the facilities, most of the time, you're going to deal with the front business office individuals who are mostly concerned with money. In fact, I have seen that these individuals, there's turnover constantly, because they are basically required to bring in a certain amount of money. And if they don't, then they get fired. So they kind of hop to different facilities, which is something that I've seen. But in dealing with the facilities specifically, when you are dealing with long-term care, this is something that I always tell clients right away, is that I always want to be involved when dealing with the facility. That means from start to finish. When you go into the facility, when they're trying to if anybody's getting discharged, anything like that, I prefer to be the one to talk to the facility, because to be frank about it all, they just will flat out lie to clients' faces in terms of costs, what to expect, anything like that. So right from the beginning, I always ask that clients have me involved, let me talk with the facility. One of the main things that we work on, and that's very important to note when dealing with this, is the contract. It's not uncommon for people to come in to me after the fact when a contract's already signed which is unfortunate because once the contract is signed, there's not really much you can do. But a lot of times within that contract, at most of the facilities, they're all pretty bad and they all mostly just generally go against the Nursing Home Reform Act and any other right that the resident has or the resident's power of attorney. So one thing to consider is to make sure that you don't just sign the contract for the facility without reading it all the way through. Some main provisions in a facility contract that I've had issues with. One, making the family members personally liable for any expenses that can't be covered, and that would include anything not covered by Medicaid, even if the facility was the one who applied for Medicaid, but the Medicaid got denied because they didn't do it properly, then the family would still be responsible for those payments, stuff like that. There's other ones in there that basically say they're not liable for anything that happens to the individual in the facility, including death. So there's quite a bit of language about that. And also there's quite a few of them, specifically I've seen this in the assisted and supportive living facilities, is that they have their contracts do not allow for Medicaid planning. So again, we'll get to that more at the end. But in order to do Medicaid planning, you have to have the authority to do it. That's in your documents, but that also means that you cannot sign a contract that says you're not allowed to do different types of things with assets in order to do asset preservation. So that's something to consider. Powers of attorney. So this is another big thing that I see when dealing with facilities, and it's something that I always point out right from the beginning. It's not uncommon for powers of attorney to sign the facility contract on behalf of the individual that's going into the facility, which is fine, but it's really important to make sure that your powers of attorney have all of the necessary authorities in them, and also protect you as the agent under power of attorney. So if you are signing a contract on behalf of a family member or a spouse and you're signing as power of attorney, it's really important to, one, make sure that your powers of attorney have the necessary language in there to allow for Medicaid planning. Two, they can protect you against liability that should not fall on you if it weren't for this contract. And three, when you are signing, never sign your name, comma, POA. There is a specific way that you should be signing, and it's not always how people sign, but what you do is you sign the resident's name by your name, comma, POA. So a lot of people make the mistake that if I were signing a contract, for example, on behalf of my mother, I would sign her name by my name, comma, agent. A lot of people would just sign my name, comma, agent. That is just looking for, that's just little ways that you can get locked into more liability. So it's things like that that you need to consider. And also a lot of times when the facilities say that you're signing as only power of attorney, just know that somewhere in that contract, it's more than likely going to say something like responsible representative or responsible agent or something, which means that it's not just your power of attorney, but it's the person who's going to be liable for any expenses on that individual's behalf if they cannot pay for their care. Again, that's all avoidable, which is why I always ask people to let me review the contract or have your attorney review the contract for certain terms to make sure that they're not in there. Like I said earlier, in dealing with the administration versus staff, it's two totally separate groups of people, but just to be very aware that the people who are in the business office are very concerned with money and they're not against saying one thing that's not necessarily true. Types of facilities, they vary in terms of the contracts, but also how they correlate with Medicaid and how you can be on public benefits in those, like I had mentioned with the assisted and supportive living facilities, and Medicaid applications. So that's another thing that I've seen when dealing with facilities. So people oftentimes, clients will go in to a facility. Let's say, for example, I was helping a grandparent get into this facility, and it wouldn't be uncommon for the business office to say, okay, yeah, just fill out these forms. And then once all the money's depleted, we will go ahead and apply for Medicaid for you. So the issue is that with that is if the facility applies for Medicaid for somebody before they're eligible for Medicaid, it locks them into spend down, which requires essentially requires that who's ever applied for Medicaid, the only way they can spend any money they have left is on the facility or on healthcare. In other words, it locks you in and does not allow you to preserve assets or do any Medicaid planning before applying. So I've had clients in the past where the facility has literally submitted a Medicaid application, even though there was a house still out there and there was like $300,000 in cash assets. Well, if once that Medicaid application is submitted, they're locked in. And so now let's say that $300,000 in cash would be required to be spent on healthcare or onto the facility, rather than using that $300,000 to, prepay cremation and burial expenses and other sorts of things that you can do for Medicaid planning and Medicaid planning purposes. Costs of long-term care. So this is what I had mentioned earlier. The average cost for long-term care or in-home caregivers, it was about 60 grand for homemaker services and home health aid. It ranged from $19 to $36 an hour, average at $27 an hour nationally. And note here that, like I think I previously mentioned, in-home caregiving is not covered by Illinois Medicaid. Medicaid is a state by state, it's a federal program, but it's state by state laws. And so depending on which state you're in, there are states that do have in-home care coverage through their Medicaid, but Illinois is not one of them as of right now. Cost of long-term care when it comes to the facilities. So independent living, like I said, that's one level lower than the assisted supportive living. So it's really like when my grandma had her own independent living place, it was an actual house that was close to the facility where the assisted living was, which she went into eventually. Assisted living in Illinois is around $54,000 per year. It says, I was looking at different figures earlier this week regarding the different states, and it says that in Missouri, it averages around $3,000 per month, which is insanely cheap, to around $7 grand per month in the District of Columbia. In Illinois, the stats show it's about $2,745 per month in Illinois. I can say for a fact, just based on the work I've done in Southern Illinois and the work I've done in Chicago, that this is way more directed at Southern Illinois. You're not going to find an assisted living facility in the Chicagoland area that's under $6 grand, I would say $5-6 grand maybe. Supportive living facilities, again, same as assisted living, except they will take Medicaid. And cost of long-term skilled care. So this is an image that I had found the other day from Genworth's Financials 2022 report. It shows the semi-private room median. So just for purposes of planning later on when we talk about Medicaid, in Illinois, in order to be eligible for Medicaid, you have to be in a Medicaid approved bed in the facility. So if it's not a supportive living facility, then it would be a nursing home or a skilled care facility. Well, in a skilled care facility, you can have a private room or you can have a semi-private room. A private room would be your own room. As far as I know, I have not seen Illinois Medicaid cover anything but a semi-private room. I have had one situation where they did cover it, but it was, there was no other option. But you're required to have a semi-private room, which means that you have at least one roommate. So that's what these averages are. And the average semi-private room rate in Alaska was $1,036 a day. And it was as low as $169 per day in Texas. And when I say as low as, that really does add up a lot. So it comes into playing in the importance of long-term care planning, because what does seem like a lot of money to someone now, I've seen people come to me with $750,000. And by the time we're planning and taking care of everything, and you pay 1 year's worth at a facility, and that's a big chunk of money that's gone. And so if you really just, a lot of times when you calculate just about, if you look into your assets or kind of figure out where you're at, if you were to calculate to see, okay, well, what happens if I were to need to long-term care tomorrow? What would the cost be, and how long would I have private pay to be able to pay for that sort of thing? It's really important because these costs have just gotten outrageous and they only continue to grow. So it says the lowest, like I said, 169 per day in Texas. I would say I think this is the next slide, just in case. Oh yeah, no. In Illinois, so again, it says Illinois here is 206 per day. From personal and professional experience, definitely not the case in the Chicagoland area. You're looking at more like 380 to 450 per day. 206 per day in Southern Illinois seems close, but I think that may even be low. And so I also included some other states around us and their average daily rate for a skilled care semi-private room. Wisconsin, 297, Indiana, 239, Michigan, 299, Iowa, 226, and Missouri is 173. And Missouri is actually the second lowest on the list. So paying for long-term care. So there are various different ways, and I know I had seen one question come through first about long-term care insurance, but these are the lists of ways that you can pay for your long-term care. There's the private pay rates, which is what we had just looked at with the averages. There is long-term care insurance. I will be completely honest, I very, very unlikely or very seldom do I have clients that still have long-term care insurance. I would say within the first couple of years of me starting to practice, I saw it more. I don't think I've seen it a single time in probably the last 4 years. People just don't have it. I know a lot of times I've had clients come in where they say they just stopped paying it like last year or something. Please don't do that. If you have long-term care insurance, it's very beneficial. And I think that unless you absolutely cannot afford to do so, I would recommend that you keep that long-term care insurance. The younger you are, the easier it is to get it. Obviously, I can't say for sure what age is best, because it's also going to depend on your health and your health factors and medical history and everything else. But if you don't have it, I do recommend it's something that you look into. I am not myself an expert on long-term care insurance, but I have worked with it and I do work with it. And if there's anybody who's looking more or interested in learning more about long-term care insurance, I would refer you to, it's called Mrs. LTC. Her name is Stana Martin, and she is an advocate and helps individuals obtain long-term care insurance, because the difficulty with that has gotten very high as well. And there's also, which again, I'm not an expert on, but I have been talking more with a couple of different financial planners and accountants now who have talked about this. It's like a partial insurance. It's a newer thing. I think it's come around in like the last 3-4 years. Again, it's a concept that I'm still learning more about and I'm not an expert about, but I just wanted to mention it because it is an option. Other ways, VA benefits. Those for anybody with active in prior service, there are quite a few different types of VA benefits. To be honest, I have actually set up individual presentations on all of these different topics because they are so complex. But there are a lot of different ways that you can obtain VA benefits. There's a few different types of them. And I would be happy to point to resources or other individuals who can talk more on VA benefits. My experience with VA benefits mostly comes down to how well it does not work with Medicaid. VA benefits can be beneficial if you're not going into a nursing home or a skilled care facility. Because VA benefits, it's mostly income, and it only covers so much. So if you're paying 12 grand a month for a nursing home, $1,000 a month, that's going to get paid to the facility anyway, is not doing much. So a lot of times when I get involved in VA benefits is when I cancel VA benefits to get people on Medicaid. You can do both. They don't necessarily play well together. They both are separate programs with separate requirements. And one thing that has been unfortunate in the past is that the VA benefits look back period is not as long, or was not as long as Medicaid's. So there had been issues that I've seen issues with people that had been doing VA benefit planning, did something that went against Medicaid policies because of the different timelines. So again, that's an option, but it doesn't always fit well or go well with Medicaid. And oftentimes when I'm involved in it, it would be either for a lower level of care facility or canceling VA benefits to get Medicaid eligibility. And then the last part is Medicaid, which is the primary focus of the rest of today's presentation. So Medicaid planning, what's true and what's not. So Medicaid myths. Medicare and Medicaid are two very different programs. It's something that I see oftentimes people do confuse, but Medicare is health insurance, and it is a right after a certain age, whereas Medicaid is not a right. You have to apply, you have to be eligible, and you have to be approved to get coverage. It is a federal program, but it's state by state rules and regulations. So what happens and what's allowed in Illinois may be different than in Florida versus Missouri, and likewise. I oftentimes hear people tell me that they don't want the government to take away all of their money. So that's why they don't want to apply for Medicaid. But that's not, the government's not going to take all your money. It's the facility that's going to take all your money. And then the government will be willing to pay, is basically how that goes. But that's not how it has to go. So like I said, it's not uncommon for facilities to tell people that, yes, that's what has to happen. You have to spend all your money. And then once you only have $2,000 to your name, then you can apply for Medicaid. That's not true. There are things, like I said earlier when we were talking about the facilities, like spend down issues. So if you apply for Medicaid before you actually meet Medicaid eligibility, you will have what's called a spend down or a penalty. A spend down is, like I was talking earlier, when a facility, like for example, if a facility applied and there was still money there and the applicant had more than $2,000 to their name, all of that money would be required to be spent down, and then Medicaid would kick in. But Medicaid, since they had already applied, it would be Medicaid pending. So moving on, and the government, it's gotten better. Well, I wouldn't say gotten better. It's changed a lot since 2020 with COVID. Prior to 2020, we were required to, I would submit at least one, sometimes two, sometimes three binders this thick of paperwork. And they would come back and they would request the same thing. And if people didn't submit that paperwork in time, it would be denied for failure to provide documentation. So it's pretty common and pretty, at least in the past, they're not happy to be approving these applications. They're going to look for any and all reasons, and they're going to look for any and all reasons over the next 5 years or over the prior 5 years, because there's a 5-year look back period. Again, you don't have to spend all your money first. There are legal ways to do it. They're under Medicaid policies, and they're all legal. And also, facilities do not always have your best interest in mind. Again, people, the front desk people, their responsibility, their job is to bring money in. They're going to say what they've been told to say. And so it's just important to make sure, because it's unfortunate, because a lot of times these families and clients are already in very rough situations. They're dealing with a lot. It's an emotional situation. They're moving a loved one into a facility. There's emotions are already running high. People are already stressing out. And so it's easy for people to just believe what they hear when the facility says, oh yeah, it's totally fine. We'll apply for Medicaid for you. It's not a big deal. Or yeah, go ahead and sign that contract. Representative just means power of attorney. No. So just make sure to read through everything and ask or make sure that they're being open and honest. The basics. Okay, so the basics of Medicaid planning. So there's the 5-year look back. Basically what happens, so let's say you were going to apply for Medicaid on April 1st of 2023. The look back period would be April 1st of 2018. So 5-year look back period. And what you would have to do is collect 5 years worth of statements for any and all accounts and assets that you have had over that 5-year look back period. If there's spouses and one spouse is going into a facility and the other spouse is staying in the community, the rules change. But still it's the 5-year look back, and it looks at any and all accounts during that timeline. That includes accounts that were closed during those 5 years, 5 years, accounts that were opened and then closed, accounts that were joint, that were individual, all accounts. And when we do a Medicaid application, and this is something that I know has been an issue in the past, and it's oftentimes, again, when people at the facilities are doing the Medicaid applications, they are not fully, or they're not providing everything that's there. They're not providing all of the assets. They're not providing the truth in terms of the 5-year look back or everything else. But when we do it from a legal perspective, you obviously have to just disclose everything. So we would disclose all accounts. We would have statements for all 5 years, and you have to submit all of that. And you also have to have checks, check images, deposit slips, and withdrawal slips for any amounts that were taken out over $1,000. So in addition to having 5 years worth of statements for any and all accounts, you have to have for any transfers over $1,000, whether it was a deposit, a withdrawal, a check, you have to have an explanation. You have to explain where that money went, because what DHS is essentially doing is they're looking at this application, finding reasons to deny you. So you have to prove that over the 5 years prior to needing Medicaid, that you didn't transfer away your money just to apply for Medicaid. That's what they're looking for. But unfortunately, because they're not freely giving away money, they are oftentimes looking for, they'll find any reason to not push this application through. So the 5-year look back period, and examples of things that I've seen come through that tend to cause problems are things like irrevocable trusts, because that's one way that you can preserve assets. But if let's say you had heard from somebody, some attorney said that it was a good idea to do an irrevocable trust because what money goes into the irrevocable trust is not subject to Medicaid. That's true and not true at the same time, because if you move money into an irrevocable trust within that 5-year look back period, it's going to be disclosed to the state, and you will get penalized for that transfer because that transfer would not be exempt. So again, 5-year look back period. So I have this huge checklist that I would provide clients, basically that they can check off everything, because it includes money markets, CDs, IRAs, 401ks, any and all assets. It also includes your house, any vehicles. There are asset limits for an individual going into a facility who is applying for Medicaid. They can have $2,000 total to their name. That includes all accounts, everything, just $2,000. So imagine, that's like no money at all. That's absolutely no money. So if you're a community spouse, here we go. If you're a community spouse, this is a big concern. And so that's going to be one of the other main focuses, is the community spouse. Is the community spouse transfers and exempt types of techniques that we use. So in addition to the 5-year look back period that you need to be aware of, there's the asset limit. So it's $2,000 for the applicant themselves. They just changed the numbers for the community spouses. So I need to find, oh, but that's on the next page. So I will look at that next. Other types of asset preservation techniques that we do for Medicaid planning are things like caregiver agreements, which is related to the caregiving, and the exempt transfers. So exempt transfers include things like transfers to children with disabilities, transfers to spouse or family members who have fall under certain categories, and then transfers to others other than to qualify for Medicaid. Non-exempt transfers are transfers that will ultimately end up in you either being denied Medicaid coverage or in penalty being implemented, which means that yes, you can be you're approved for Medicaid, except for a certain amount of time. The issue with that is when there's a penalty period, you only have $2,000. So you don't have the money to pay 3 more months at a nursing home, which is going to be 30+ grand. So what's the issue? That's when that's when those contracts come into play. That's when the facility contracts come into play. That's when I say you need to be careful, because that's when they may come after the family. So you have to make sure to not have that liability in connection with that facility. So that's another thing that can happen, the non-exempt transfers. Common issues that I've seen with Medicaid applications would include, it's not uncommon for family members to come in that haven't been involved in a long time. So for example, a son that had been, had not really talked with his father for 7 years is now responsible for getting his father qualified for Medicaid. So you can understand the difficulty in that they have had no communication. He has no idea what accounts are out there. He has no idea what transfers have been made, nothing. So that is oftentimes a big difficulty, and that tends to lead to issues with getting documentation from financial institutions and everything else. So my suggestion with that would be to just consider to start planning now, no matter what age you're at, because I mean, I plan now because I do this for a living and I see it so often that it's almost second nature. But so many people aren't aware of any of this and they have no idea, and they are only first ever introduced to this situation at that exact moment, because it's their first parent who needs to go into a facility, or their spouse is needing to go into a facility. So it's not something that you see very often. So it's a good idea to have this knowledge, or to at least have the basics of it up front, so you can start planning now, or at least know what not to do. So again, some common issues. One would be issues in getting information because of the family wasn't close, or it's not uncommon for the parent in a situation to be very private about their assets, or if it's a spouse situation, it's not uncommon for one spouse to have dealt with all of that stuff while the other spouse has no idea. So it's a very common situation, but it's also something that could be very helpful in that you're just more open with your family, or that you leave instructions in terms of where your accounts are, where what the passwords are, something to make it easier for them to obtain all this information when it's necessary. Other issues I've seen are with caregivers, in-home caregivers. So I had mentioned that early on. $27 an hour, can get outrageously expensive. So it's not uncommon. It's been less common lately, but especially when I first started, I saw it all the time, is we were seeing checks being written out to cash, or just a bunch of cash going missing. And we couldn't then explain it to Medicaid. But what we realized was happening was that this cash was getting paid to in-home caregivers, because if you go through a service, it's way more expensive. But if you go through, if you're paying cash to under the table to these caregivers, what's happening is that they're not paying taxes on it, so they're not reporting it, which means Medicaid you're going to have issues with Medicaid, because when you go back to Medicaid and say, well, I wasn't just transferring this money to get approved for Medicaid, I was transferring it in order to pay for care. Well, how are you going to prove that? And obviously there are ways to do that. It's not, like I said, it's not uncommon, but one way to avoid that is to, one, write checks directly to the caregiver, and include memos on your checks for what the services are for, or just go through a caregiving service. But again, that's all very pricey, but that's something to consider. Other issues I've seen come through, or like I said, if somebody had talked with somebody who was not necessarily an elder law attorney or familiar with long-term care planning, they may have gone to see somebody who had decided that it was a good idea to put assets into an irrevocable trust. Again, if you transfer anything into an irrevocable trust within the 5-year look back period, that is again considered a non-exempt transfer. And so it's going to cause issues with Medicaid. Other examples I've seen are children who are still living with their parents and living off of their parents. That causes a lot of problems. And also things like gifts. So again, it's very important to realize that any transfer over $1,000 is going to get looked at. What I do for that is it's a big spreadsheet of all the different transactions. But even if, you have to show everything. So if you transfer $1,000 to a child for a wedding present, that will get looked at and that will need to be explained and will likely become a penalty under Medicaid. And again, but that's the best part about this planning stuff is even if there are these issues, even if you've done things over this 5-year look back that are going to cause problems with Medicaid, if you plan ahead, we can plan for those and we can avoid, a big financial hit or a Medicaid denial. Common techniques. So again, there's quite a few techniques that you can use under Medicaid planning. A few that I use pretty often would be prepaid cremation and burial plans. That's something I always encourage people to do because under Medicaid policies, that is an exempt asset, but you need to make sure to have the correct paperwork. So cremation, a prepaid cremation. There are things like transfers to children with disabilities. So if you have a child with a disability, any transfer to that child is exempt under Medicaid policies. So that is the idea being, because DHS's view on that is that money is going to somebody else who would eventually need long-term care anyway. And so that is an option. There's pooled trusts, which are good options for people under the age of 65. There is what's called a Medicaid compliant annuity. I would say that's probably one of the most common forms or techniques that I use to preserve assets. And that's basically allows for gifting assets, but covering the penalty period by, again, planning ahead. So, and one last thing before I move on to the community spouse stuff is that there are really two types of Medicaid planning. The pre-planning or the emergency planning. I would say 99% of the time is the emergency planning, and that is within the 5-year look back period. If you're doing way ahead planning, and if you have enough money and are comfortable enough to put money into like an irrevocable trust or something like that with outside of the 5-year look back period, that is also planning, and that would preserve that asset from Medicaid so long as it was outside of the 5-year look back period. But I would say 99% of the planning I do and that I see is the emergency planning, which means it's within the 5 years because someone needs to go into a facility like now. And so that's normally what I'm looking into, and those are the type of techniques that we use. Okay, so for community spouses, this is basically, again, like I had said earlier, it's basically when one spouse needs to go into a facility, and the other spouse is still living in their home in the community or somewhere in the community. When that is the situation, there is an income and asset limit, which actually just changed for the first time since I've been practicing this year. And so as of this year, the total asset limit for the community spouse is $120,780 total, which is up from $109,560 as of last year. So that means that by the time that somebody's able to apply for Medicaid, they have to have $120,780 or less to their name. The spouse who's in the facility has to have $2,000, and then they can apply for Medicaid. But again, you know, $120,000, a little over 120 grand is not a lot of money to last somebody for a lot of number of years. And a lot of times, I mean, this person's going to be retired. They're not going to be in the best physical health themselves, and they may eventually need care too. But at the same time, 120 grand is not going to last a very long time. So what the goal there is to try to preserve as much money as possible for the community spouse, while also getting the institutionalized spouse on Medicaid so that the community spouse can still live and still have money and freedom and a life. Because really, I mean, other than spending all of their money to the facility. So asset limit 120,780, and the income as of this year is $3,715.50 per month. This is up from $2,739 last year. So this is the monthly income. So again, in addition to being able to preserve assets for the community spouse, we can potentially also preserve income. It's up to a certain amount. So unless the community spouse has income of over this amount, this $3,715.50, then we can potentially save money from the institutionalized spouse to give to the community spouse. That's again another technique for Medicaid that is allowable, and it's something that should always be looked into if there's a community spouse. There are plenty of ways for somebody to preserve assets, plenty of ways. So it's just important to make sure that you're aware of those so that so you don't just feel trapped in that there's only the only thing that you can do is spend all of your money and that's it. But in addition to these assets, I also just want to clarify. So if the community spouse can have assets up to this total amount, can also have a house, which is up to, it's like $585,000, plenty big. But you're allowed to have a house up to that value. And then you're also allowed to have a vehicle as the community spouse. And again, using and having and understanding those rules allows you to plan ahead and, rearrange assets or change certain assets in order to get the best value out of that, while also getting your spouse on Medicaid. So their $10,000, $12,000 a month coverage for long-term care is covered. Sample applicant. So I just wanted to, because there's just so much, it's a volume of information with all this stuff. I wanted to just kind of go through a sample applicant so we could quickly look through ways or kind of like the thought process in terms of how this goes. So in this situation, the client would be the husband and he needs long-term care. Let's say he's going into a nursing home. The husband has a wife and 2 children. One of the children has a disability, but they're an adult disability. And he does have estate planning documents. The assets that he has would be IRAs, checking savings, a house, 2 cars, and the income is they both get Social Security and the husband gets the pension. So a very quick sample, general view of this would be to look at the family situation. So yes, there's a community spouse. So the big thing is that the goal in my mind would be to preserve as many assets as possible for the wife so that she can continue living even though her husband is in a skilled care facility. If there's only certain things that we can do for the wife, the one thing to note is that there is a child that has a disability. So that is a way that we can also preserve assets. So if we can't, let's say there is a total of 600 grand here and a $400,000 house. If we can't get all $600,000 to the wife without causing issues with eligibility, the other option would be to transfer some of that either to the child with a disability or to a special needs trust for the child with a disability. So let's say again, like I said, $600,000 in assets, $400,000 house. One option that we could do that we have for preserving assets would be for the wife to sell the current house for $400,000 and purchase a new house for closer to $585,000. It sounds like, you know, that's one of those techniques that's long planning. It would be a lot of work, but it is an option because then once we get on Medicaid, then the lady does not need that whole house, a $585,000 house. She can sell that house, buy a $200,000 condo, and then she's got that cash that she can now use to preserve moving forward. IRAs, one thing that is really unfortunate that I just want to mention really quickly is that IRAs is something that I see often, and that is problematic because so many people who are retired have not really been taking money from their IRAs. And it's not uncommon for financial planners to push and push and push for people to keep their IRA because it's tax deferred. But once somebody is retired, that is the best time to be using that money. You're going to be in your lowest tax bracket available. And so you need to start pulling down that money. And the main reason being that if, and this is a big thing, I see it all of the time. If you're coming in and somebody, if let's say they have 200,000 in checking and 600 or $500,000 in an IRA, that IRA is only worth $500,000 minus taxes. So you wouldn't want to use an IRA for a community spouse, for example, because, you know, if community spouse is only allowed to have the 12780, you don't want to use, you don't want to 100 grand of that to be an IRA, because that's not actually worth 100 grand. So that's something to consider. And so it's an issue that we constantly see people come in that are so top heavy with the IRAs, because if you need to liquidate it in order to get on Medicaid or get into a long-term care or to pay for your care in general, you're about to take a big tax hit because you're going to have to liquidate all of it. And so one of the ways that you can potentially save money with that, it would be to liquidate it and withhold a certain percentage because tax refunds are exempt. So that's another thing that we could do with that. The checking and savings, what I normally do with that would be for the applicant to have one account. It would be a checking account. It's where the applicant's income goes and where they pay for their health insurance and their monthly expenses. And then everything else would be transferred to the wife's name. So the husband's name is no longer on the accounts. They would have 1 year to do this. I prefer to do that, but prior to submitting the application. But you do have 1 year to take your the applicant's name off of the accounts in the house. And so just so you know, so for the house, like I said, and then once the application, so moving forward, then once you submit an application, once the application is submitted, DHS or the state does not have the authority to go back to the community spouse and ask what the assets are. They can only go back each year to confirm income. So once the applicant once we have approval of Medicaid and we've gotten the community spouse to get this 12780, then we can begin working on ways to get her more cash, which is where the house thing comes in. And again, you can start building up assets because 120 grand is just not a lot of money. to continue out the rest of your life, especially since a lot of times the person's going to be retired. And I believe that that is, we could go a lot of different ways with the sample applicant information, but that is all I had for right now. I think that I was supposed to end at 8, so I just want to make sure before I continue going on.
You're good. We started a couple minutes early. Thank you so much, Paige. Thank you for providing all this information for us. It's clearly very important. And like you said, right, the earlier you start planning, the better. So I know a lot of our guests tonight have a lot of questions, and I already see some popping up in our chat. So let's get that conversation started. Our first question on here says, what age is the best time to purchase long-term insurance?
So I had seen that earlier before I started presenting, but sorry, the dogs are at the door. But I can't for sure say what the best age would be. I do know that if you wait too long, it's very unlikely that you're going to get accepted or even get any coverage. So in terms of the long-term care insurance, I would say visit Mrs. LTC or look up Stana Martin. She is wonderful and she is an expert at long-term care insurance. And so she can definitely help with that. I'm sorry, I can't answer more on that though.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you for that reference. Another question that we have is, does a life insurance policy count towards assets income when applying for Medicaid for an elderly person?
Yes. Yep, it does. And it depends on, so life insurance is a little bit trickier because it depends on who the owner is, whose life it's covering, but it is considered an asset, but there's also ways of handling it. One of the things you could do is sell it or purchase the life insurance policy off of the applicant for basically the cash value. Otherwise, you would have to liquidate the policy or close out the policy. Yeah.
Will LT Care cover home care for dementia?
Well, long-term care, no. So unfortunately, no in-home care is covered by Illinois Medicaid. It's very unfortunate. There are states that do have Medicaid that cover home caregivers, but not Illinois. In terms of the dementia, there's nothing specific for that. There are, like, for example, there's the memory units. The memory units are basically assisted living facilities that have a keypad on them. So people that are like a escape risk are prevented from doing so. But in terms of specific care for dementia, that's really all there is. And there's not a huge difference. But there's there's only assisted living facilities that I'm aware of that are focused specifically on dementia, which means that those facilities are not even covered by Medicaid at all. So it would be all private pay.
That's so interesting. Another question that we have is, does Illinois allow ABLE support?
Yep. The ABLE account. Wait, where is this one? Yes, we do have the ABLE accounts if that's what that's referring to. And there are, I think it's 100. Yes, we definitely have. And that is another planning technique or options that's there. So yes.
A question that we have is, if you're soon going into a nursing home, what are the timelines for that?
Okay, I just need to read the question. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Is that 7:45?
Soon going into what are timelines? So Medicaid in for a nursing home is different than Medicaid for like a supportive living facility, but there's no Medicaid for home coverage or home health. In terms of if you're going into a facility soon, what are the timelines? I would say definitely start collecting 5 years worth of assets or 5 years worth of statements for all your assets, getting that organized. You need to make sure to find a Medicaid approved facility there are websites out there that list both all of the all of the supportive living facilities and all of the nursing homes or skilled care facilities. Then you can confirm whether or not they're Medicaid approved. But I would recommend going into a facility that's Medicaid approved so that you can do Medicaid planning. I would say depending on the timeline, you can't apply for Medicaid unless you're in a Medicaid approved bed. So that's another misconception that people have, is that they think that you can apply now. And then once you go into a nursing home or something, that then they cover it. But no, you have to be in the facility and you have to meet all eligibility requirements, both financial and the facility and everything else in order to get Medicaid. So I would say start working on that now. And because the more that you're ready and prepared to apply for Medicaid, the less money you're going to have to spend private paying the facility, which can be 8 to 14 grand a month.
Ooh, wow, a lot. The question right below it says, is Medicaid for a nursing home different than Medicaid for healthcare?
No. So again, Medicaid doesn't cover anything in home. It covers the care for you at a facility, whether it's skilled care facility or a supportive living facility. It pays for that, but it won't pay for in-home care.
Oh, good to know. Next one says irrevocable trust is not exempt. That was in quotation marks. From 5-year look back includes SNT for disabled adult. This one was at 755.
Okay. So it's not that irrevocable trust is not exempt. It's that the transfers into that irrevocable trust are not exempt. So if you have an irrevocable trust and let's say you got an irrevocable trust in 2017, if you applied for Medicaid now, that irrevocable trust is irrelevant. And in fact, any money and any assets that you put in that irrevocable trust will be exempt from Medicaid because they are outside of that 5-year look back period. The issue is if you created an irrevocable trust in 2021 and decided to transfer $300,000 into that irrevocable trust, just thinking, well, I want to protect that for my kids or something. And then 2 years later, you need to go into a nursing home and need to apply for Medicaid. That will not be exempt. That transfer will be considered, you will get penalized for that transfer, and all $300,000 you will be penalized for. So it's essentially, it's the same idea. So you can transfer it in there, but you will still have to get the Medicaid penalty and it will have to be handled a different way.
That's very good to know.
Oh, wait, for the second part, it says includes special needs trust for an adult with a disability. No. So adult transfers to adults with disabilities, transfers to anybody with a disability are exempt. I mean, your family. So that includes a special needs trust, whether it's a third party or a first party special needs trust. Transfers can be made to adults with disabilities.
That's good to know too. Next question on here says, for example, my mom has taken cash out of her life insurance policy on her ex-husband to pay her expenses. Is this a non-exempt asset?
So yes, I mean, a non-exempt asset would essentially be anything, if it's a person applying, anything over $2,000. But yes, this would be considered non-exempt. And so in order to apply for Medicaid, that would have to be completely depleted, essentially, or sold. The life insurance policy could be sold to somebody else. But the fact that it's the ex-husband, I see what you're saying now. That could also cause issues. Yes, because technically it's the state could look at it like it's a gift. And this is the thing. So if anytime an applicant gives away money, it's going to be assumed that they did that for purposes of applying for Medicaid, and it's going to be your responsibility to prove otherwise. If you receive money, then the state looks at it like a gift. and it's a gift. But if you try to give that money back, then you would be in trouble for it. So it's just very, yeah. So anything that you're paying towards something else, it's going to need to be explained. But yeah, it will cause issues.
This one question down here says, what disabilities are eligible to do exempt transfers?
So that, I mean, that's, if you have any sort of documentation, I would say that that's going to depend on what you're wanting to do, but I am comfortable doing it once I have written determination from like a physician that there was a legal or a disability determination, a legal disability determination. Other things would be like if you're on SSI, SSDI, those are both considered, that's good enough evidence of a disability as well. But a special needs trust, I mean, it's even if there is a concern about, you know, I wouldn't necessarily transfer it right to the individual with the disability. Then there's always the option of transferring it to a trust for the individual, which is most of the time the best answer.
Any more background how to preserve assets using this method?
And to the children with disabilities transfers.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, the main thing about that is to realize that it's to children with disabilities. And that I always recommend that you, again, if there isn't like an SSI or SSDI determination, that you have some sort of written letter from the doctor verifying that there's a disability that is causing hardship, but as much information and detail as possible. And yeah, and so like but again, the transfers to a trust, I would feel more comfortable with in terms of not having issue or pushback from the state.
Thank you. This one also says, how critical is Medicaid to qualify for mental health case management? For example, turning point or threshold, aside from housing per se.
So I'm not sure, to be honest. So I don't know if it applies at all, because there's a bunch of different types of facilities in terms of like the SILAs and all of those, like the different types of housing, but I'm not sure if any of that is covered by these programs, and but I'm not familiar with those processes though.
Yeah. Do you recommend this person maybe going out and speaking with somebody from Turning Point or Threshold to see if they can get the answer to this question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm happy to look more into that. And, or if they sent something to me, I can look more into it too, in terms of specific services and everything else.
Thank you, Paige. I appreciate that. As a matter of policy, should we be advocating for home health care to be covered in Illinois?
Yes. Yeah. I mean,
Blank.
the whole system is a mess, but, and I do, so NALA, the National Academy of Elder Law Attorneys, we have a legislation committee that is constantly down in Springfield advocating for stuff like that. And I do know that that's one of them, that's something that is a big concern for a lot of people. And I would love to see it. So.
Awesome. Well, where do you look for states with long-term care coverage?
Where do I look for states? So you can, I mean, honestly, I would start with the federal site and go from there. I always just type in Illinois Medicaid, and it brings me to its DHS or CMS websites. But it's going to depend on the different states, and it's really never clear where the information's at on the state website or what's actually covered. There's the policy manual, the Medicaid policy manual that I recommend looking into. That could be helpful. That's where I refer in terms of exempt versus non-exempt assets and transfers and the like. All of those rules and regulations are in there. They're just complicated and hard to find. Not necessarily unintentionally. So, but yeah, I mean, and also a good spot would be, so NALA, National Academy of Elder Law Attorneys, they have an attorney finder, and that's for the all of 50 states. So you can find attorneys who are focused in elder law who would likely be able to answer that better.
That's a very helpful resource. Great. Another question says, is paying someone privately for LTC out of pocket prohibited?
It depends. So if the biggest issues you're going to have is if you're private paying a family member or somebody in your family, any transfer to a family member, whether or not it's legitimate or exempt, they will look at twice as hard. So it's just always to be careful with that and to make sure you document everything. The biggest thing is proving that that's why you were paying them and that's what they were doing. So making sure you have as much documentation as possible, verifying the care, verifying the payments, where they went, that's important. But if you're doing it, like if a family member is going to be caring for the individual, then I highly recommend that you do a caregiver agreement prior to making any payments, and that caregiver agreement be in writing, it be legitimate, and it be by the books in terms of payments and everything else. Because again, anytime a family member is involved, they're going to look at it twice as hard.
Yeah, it sounds like documentation is the name of the game, huh?
Everything. Yes.
Yeah, for sure. The next question says, what about a revocable trust?
A revocable trust? I love revocable trust, and I am a big advocate for revocable trust in general. Revocable trusts do not protect assets against Medicaid or the state. In other words, you can have all of your all of your assets in a revocable trust, and it doesn't protect it from Medicaid. It's still all subject to Medicaid and Medicaid spend down. But there are benefits to having revocable trust in general. I mean, it can avoid probate after somebody passes away. It can allow your successor trustee to step in to easily take these steps that are necessary to do Medicaid and Medicaid planning. It's an easier transition. There's a million reasons that revocable trusts are good. And specifically in terms of Medicaid planning, I usually have the community spouse do a revocable trust after we get Medicaid approved, so that we can then make sure that the assets, if something were to happen to the community spouse prior to the person or the spouse in the facility, so we didn't just do all that planning and then all that money still goes to the person in the facility and it throws off their Medicaid. So basically you would do it in your revocable trust to make sure that those assets then go to your children or however else you wanted to distribute. But yes, I love revocable trust.
Totally. Next question says, what is the Medicaid penalty and how is this determined?
So Medicaid penalty is basically what they do is, like I said, they look at all transfers over 5 years, and any transfer that they find exempt, they will add up all of those transfers and then they will penalize you for it. So I don't remember the exact calculation, but it's based on the private pay rate at the facility and the amount of money that you gifted. So let's say that you gifted $1,000 to a child, and then there was a car gifted to another child or something like that. You would total all of those up over 5 years. And then it would say, okay, yes, you are eligible and approved for Medicaid subject to a penalty period, which means that penalty period only starts after Medicaid should have started. In other words, you only have $2,000. So if you are approved for Medicaid as of April 1st of 2023, subject to a 3-month penalty, that means you're eligible for Medicaid, but for April, May, and June, you have to private pay. And then come July, Medicaid will start paying. That's the issue that we run into then, is who's going to pay those 3 months? Because now the applicant has $2,000 to their name. If there's a community spouse, we were able to preserve some money, but again, we don't want to have to pay another 30 plus grand to the facility of the money that we just saved. So that's what we're trying to avoid, is that penalty period. And that's why the importance of not signing a contract unless you reviewed it all the way, or not signing the contract as like the approved or the representative. However they use it in their term, in that specific contract. But it's just important to not sign as that person, because then you will be liable for those penalty periods. But yeah, the penalty period basically adds up all of the non-exempt transfers that you made, and then penalizes it for you, or penalizes you for that before they're willing to let Medicaid kick in.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Paige. Thank you for providing answers to all these questions. If you did post another question in here, and we did not have the time to get to it today, there is a survey at the end once we hang up on the Zoom call, that if you still have additional questions, you can go ahead and type it in the response box and as one of the questions in their survey. So today, if you enjoyed tonight's program, you can find more information about upcoming programs and events at www.namiccns.org. Our next webinar will be held on April 12th from 7 o'clock to 8:30 with guest speaker Missy Firmage, who will present on all things Guardianship 101. We're also gathering together for our annual gala. Our gala is coming up, and it is being held on April 29th. And if you're interested in purchasing a ticket, you can please visit our events tab on our website. And again, once you log off, you will see a survey that pops up that will both allow us to better understand your comfort level with today's topic, assist us with future webinar topics, as well as provide us with the data that we need to continue providing NAMI services and programs to our community. Again, Paige, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your night, creating this beautiful presentation. I know I learned a lot based on the questions. It seems like many people were engaged and also learned a ton from you. So we really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yep. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. We appreciate all of you coming as well tonight. And we look forward to seeing you again at another NAMI CCNS community webinar. Good night, everybody. Please take care of yourselves and please take care of each other. Have a good night and we'll see you soon.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Paige.